What happens when a respected judge, a corrupt deputy chief, and a brave officer caught in a web of deceit collide? Judge Malcolm Spencer's life takes a shocking turn after a routine traffic stop reveals a sinister conspiracy. With corruption reaching into every corner of the city, alliances will be tested, secrets will be exposed, and the fight for justice will ignite. Will one man's courage be enough to bring down a system built on lies? Watch now to uncover the truth that could change everything. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the tree-lined streets of Charleston's Blue Ivy Estates, a neighborhood where ambition and affluence lived side by side. Judge Malcolm Spencer adjusted his tie as the jazz tune flowing from his car's speakers matched his upbeat mood. The aroma of new leather filled his Mercedes, a vehicle he had proudly purchased to celebrate his federal appointment, a culmination of decades of relentless work, sacrifices, and belief in justice. Driving through the pristine neighborhood felt like validation. This was not just his success. It was a testament to the resilience of his late mother, who had raised him against all odds in a world that doubted him at every turn. But tonight, Malcolm wasn't just a judge. He was a son, reflecting on the journey that brought him to a place many believed he didn't belong. The rhythmic hum of his car's engine was interrupted by a blinding flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. His heart sank, the sharp sound of a police siren slicing through his moment of peace. He immediately pulled over, his trained instincts advising calm compliance. Yet a troubling sense of foreboding gnawed at him. Malcolm had done nothing wrong. He wasn't speeding, and every document for the car was in perfect order. As he parked on the shoulder, Malcolm let out a slow, measured breath. His pulse quickened as he spotted the officer approaching in his side mirror, a woman, younger than him, with a stern expression and her hand resting on the holster of her weapon. "License and registration," she barked, her tone sharp enough to pierce through his composure. Malcolm kept his movements deliberate, reaching slowly for his wallet. "Of course, officer," he said evenly, his voice betraying no hint of irritation. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Her eyes narrowed as she ignored his question, snatching the documents from his hand. Her gaze darted between him and the papers, suspicion etched across her face. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered abruptly, taking a step back and unsnapping the clasp on her holster. Malcolm froze. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Her tone was laced with impatience. "Step out of the car, now." For a moment, Malcolm thought about asserting his rights, about reminding her who he was. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw something chilling. Neighbors peeking through curtains, cell phones raised, capturing the unfolding spectacle. Shame prickled under his skin, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Officer, this must be a misunderstanding," he said, his tone steady but firm. "I'm Judge Malcolm Spencer. This is my car. I live just down the street." Her lips curled into a sneer. "A likely story. Out of the car, Judge," she emphasized mockingly. "Don't make me repeat myself." Malcolm's heart raced as he opened the door and stepped out, his mind grappling with the absurdity of the situation. The setting sun cast an orange hue on the scene, but the air felt colder than it should. "Turn around! Hands on the car!" she barked. "This is completely unnecessary," he said, raising his hands. "I've done nothing wrong, and you have no probable cause." "I said, hands on the car!" Her voice was razor sharp now, her hand gripping the butt of her gun. Malcolm complied, his jaw clenched. The humiliation burned deeper as her hands roughly patted him down, lingering longer than needed. "We've had reports of car thefts in this area," she said, her tone accusatory. "This vehicle matches the description of one stolen last week." Malcolm couldn't hold back anymore. "This car wasn't stolen," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I purchased it 3 days ago. The registration papers are in your hand. If you would just—" "Save it for the station," she interrupted coldly, reaching for her handcuffs. Something inside Malcolm snapped. Not anger, but a fierce resolve. "Before you make a grave mistake, officer," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like steel, "I suggest you call your superior. Right now." Her hand froze over the cuffs. For the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. "You expect me to believe you're a judge?" "I expect you to do your job," he replied evenly, though the weight of his words carried unmistakable authority. "Call your superior. Verify my identity before you arrest a federal judge without cause." The tension in the air was suffocating. A few neighbors ventured out from their homes, standing on their porches and sidewalks. Malcolm could feel their judgmental stares, could almost hear the whispers spreading like wildfire. The officer hesitated, then grudgingly reached for her radio. "Dispatch," she muttered, her confidence faltering. "Requesting immediate confirmation on identity of suspect." The crackling response from her radio seemed to stretch for eternity. Finally, a gruff voice broke the silence. Officer Kendall, stand down immediately. That's Judge Spencer. I repeat, stand down. I'm en route. Kendall's face drained of color. She stepped back, her hand dropping from her holster. Your Honor, she stammered, a mix of confusion and embarrassment in her voice. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Malcolm straightened his jacket, his dignity intact despite the ordeal. A misunderstanding, he echoed, his voice laced with quiet contempt. Is that what we're calling racial profiling these days, Officer Kendall? Before she could respond, the rumble of another police car approached. A tall, imposing man with salt and pepper hair stepped out. Captain Andrew Mason, head of the local precinct. Judge Spencer, he called, his voice a mixture of apology and urgency. I can't tell you how sorry I am about this incident. Rest assured, we'll get to the bottom of it. Malcolm nodded, his mind already calculating the implications. This was no isolated event. It wasn't just about him. It was about a system that allowed unconscious bias and unchecked prejudice to flourish. As Captain Mason turned to reprimand Kendall, Malcolm's thoughts took a sharper turn. This moment was bigger than his personal dignity. It was about accountability, for Kendall, for Mason, and for the system they represented. Captain, Malcolm said, his voice firm yet composed, I'd like to speak with you and Officer Kendall, not as a victim, but as someone who believes we can turn this into a teachable moment. Mason blinked, caught off guard by the judge's magnanimity. Of course, Your Honor, whatever you need. As they walked toward Mason's car, Malcolm caught sight of a young boy standing on the sidewalk, wide-eyed and curious. The boy held his mother's hand tightly, whispering something that made her glance uneasily toward the scene. Malcolm felt a pang in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for his dignity, he was fighting for that boy's future, for a world where no one would have to grow up fearing those who were sworn to protect them. This, Malcolm realized, was only the beginning. The station smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a scent Malcolm Spencer hadn't encountered in years. He sat on a cold metal bench, his hands resting in his lap, still trembling faintly from the adrenaline that had surged through his veins just moments earlier. Despite Captain Andrew Mason's insistence that the misunderstanding was being resolved, Malcolm couldn't shake the weight of what had just transpired. Officer Kendall stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly, her face a mask of barely contained defiance. Her superiors were speaking to her in hushed tones, but Malcolm caught snippets of the conversation. Completely unprofessional, one of them muttered. Another added, Do you even know who he is? Kendall's jaw tightened, and Malcolm could see the storm of emotions brewing in her eyes. Embarrassment, anger, but no sign of remorse. That cut deeper than he cared to admit. Captain Mason approached, his expression apologetic but tense. Judge Spencer, he began, his voice low. I can't tell you how deeply I regret this incident. Rest assured, disciplinary action will be taken. Officer Kendall will be thoroughly investigated. Will she? Malcolm's voice was quiet, but it carried an edge of steel. Or will this be swept under the rug, Captain? Another misunderstanding added to a long list of systemic failures? Mason looked uncomfortable, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. This was unacceptable. I'll make sure the department reviews its protocols thoroughly. Malcolm held his gaze for a long moment. He wanted to believe Mason meant it, but years of experience told him otherwise. He let the silence hang before finally speaking. I'm not looking for apologies, Captain. I'm looking for accountability. Before Mason could respond, Malcolm's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. A text from an unknown number. The message made his blood run cold. Stay in your lane, Judge. This is your only warning. His thumb hovered over the screen as a chill worked its way up his spine. Was this connected to the traffic stop, or was it about the high-profile Apex Industries case he had presided over last week? Either way, the implications were clear. This was no coincidence. Malcolm sat in the back of a precinct-issued car as it escorted him home. The ride was silent except for the faint hum of the engine. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, every detail cutting deeper into his sense of justice. His street came into view, lined with the same houses that had seemed so welcoming mere hours ago. Now it felt like enemy territory, each window a potential witness to his humiliation. As the car pulled into his driveway, Malcolm noticed something unusual. His porch light flickered weakly, and the front door, usually locked tightly, was slightly ajar. Wait here, Malcolm said to the officer driving him. The officer frowned. Judge Spencer, are you sure? I'll be fine, Malcolm interrupted, stepping out of the vehicle. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Malcolm reached for his phone to call Detective Ethan Rhodes, his oldest friend and confidant. Ethan, Malcolm said the moment the call connected. I think someone's been in my house. Can you come by? On my way, Ethan replied without hesitation. Malcolm hung up and stepped further into the house. The living room was untouched, but as he entered his home office, the pit in his stomach grew. Papers were scattered across his desk, drawers left half open. The framed photograph of his late wife, which usually sat proudly on his desk, had been knocked to the floor, the glass shattered. Pinned to the corkboard above his desk was a piece of paper with a single word scrawled across it. Careful. Ethan arrived within 20 minutes. His police-issue SUV parked discreetly down the street. He was still in his detective's uniform, his sharp eyes scanning the property as Malcolm explained what he had found. You think this is connected to the text message? Ethan asked, crouching to examine the broken picture frame. It has to be, Malcolm said. The timing is too perfect. First the traffic stop, then the text, and now this. Ethan's brow furrowed. You're not just a federal judge, Malcolm. You've made enemies, powerful ones. Any recent cases come to mind? Malcolm leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly. Apex Industries. I ruled against them last week in a workplace discrimination case. Their CEO, Alan Croswell, didn't exactly hide his contempt for me in court. Ethan's expression darkened. Croswell's not just a businessman. He's got friends in high places, politicians, cops. If he wanted to rattle you, this is exactly how he'd do it. Malcolm folded his arms, his mind racing. So what do? Report this to the authorities? File a formal complaint? Ethan hesitated, a shadow of doubt crossing his face. The system works for guys like Croswell. If this was him, you won't get far through official channels. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Then we find another way. Later that evening, Malcolm sat in his home office, meticulously reassembling the scattered files. Among the mess, he found an envelope that hadn't been there before. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy image of him speaking with Tony Parker, a whistleblower who had testified against Apex Industries. Written on the back of the photo was a chilling message. Your friend won't be so lucky next time. Malcolm's heart sank. Tony Parker had risked everything to bring the truth to light. Now, his life was in danger. Ethan returned to the office, holding a cup of coffee and wearing a grim expression. I made a few calls. There's chatter, nothing confirmed, but enough to make me think Apex might have a few officers in their pocket. This goes deeper than we thought. Before Malcolm could respond, his phone vibrated again. Another text from the same unknown number. Last warning, Judge. Malcolm turned the phone toward Ethan. They're trying to scare me. It won't work. Ethan frowned. You're sure about that? Because these people don't just scare, they eliminate problems. Malcolm straightened his shoulders, his resolve hardening. Let them come. I've fought my whole life to get here, Ethan. I'm not backing down now. As Ethan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, Malcolm couldn't help but feel a spark of determination. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about exposing a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of everyone else. Outside, the street was quiet, the flickering porch light casting long shadows across the lawn. Somewhere in the darkness, Malcolm knew his adversaries were watching. But he refused to flinch. The gray dawn filtered through Malcolm Spencer's home office as he reviewed the scattered files on his desk. He hadn't slept much since the incident at the precinct, his thoughts preoccupied with the implications of the threats and the break-in. His focus now shifted to the photo of Tony Parker, the whistleblower who had testified against Apex Industries. The warning scrawled on the back of the picture, "Your friend won't be so lucky next time," gnawed at his resolve. The clock struck 8 a.m. as his phone buzzed. Malcolm picked it up, half expecting another cryptic threat, but this time it was a call. Judge Spencer? A nervous voice on the other end asked. This is Malcolm, he replied cautiously. It's Tony Parker. I need to talk to you, in person. It's important. Where are you? A diner on the east side of town, Tony said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll text you the address, but come alone. Please. The call ended abruptly, leaving Malcolm staring at his phone. He felt the familiar weight of anticipation and dread pressing down on him. The diner was a far cry from the polished luxury of Malcolm's neighborhood. Its cracked sign and faded paint spoke of a place forgotten by time, yet it bustled with the energy of regulars and workers passing through. Malcolm parked his car and entered, his presence immediately drawing a few curious glances. Tony sat in a corner booth, his posture tense and his eyes darting nervously around the room. His faded shirt and worn-out sneakers suggested a man who had seen better days. Judge Spencer, Tony greeted, his voice trembling. Call me Malcolm, he said, sliding into the booth. You wanted to talk? Tony nodded, leaning in as if every word could carry consequences. I don't know who else to trust. Apex, they're not just cutting corners. They're paying off inspectors, silencing employees who speak out, and worse. Malcolm's brow furrowed. Worse how? Tony hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. They're tied to some big players. Politicians, cops, even judges. They're untouchable, people who cross them. They disappear or their lives get ruined. Malcolm's stomach churned. Why come to me, Tony? What do you think I can do? You're the only one who stood up to them, Tony said, sliding an envelope across the table. This is all I've got, emails, payment records, a few internal memos. It's not everything, but it's a start. Malcolm opened the envelope and scanned the contents. Names, dates, amounts, pieces of a larger puzzle. It was enough to raise questions, but not enough to bring anyone down. I can't protect you, Tony, Malcolm said, his tone measured but firm. If they find out you gave this to me... Tony's hand trembled as he reached for his coffee. They already know. I've been followed for weeks. My phone's been tapped. They think I don't know, but I do. He looked Malcolm in the eye, desperation etched into his face. I don't care what happens to me. Just make sure they don't get away with it. Back in his office, Malcolm spread Tony's documents across his desk. The evidence painted a grim picture. Apex Industries had funneled bribes through shell companies to city officials, ensuring favorable zoning laws, ignored safety violations, and lenient court rulings. The pattern was clear, but the names listed sent a chill through Malcolm. One name stood out, Deputy Chief Mark Grayson. Meanwhile, Officer Laura Kendall sat in the police precinct's break room, her coffee growing cold as she replayed the events of the past few days in her mind. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with her. The way Deputy Chief Grayson had ordered her to pull over Malcolm Spencer, it had felt more personal than procedural. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of low voices outside the door. I'm telling you, Grayson's got it covered, one officer said. Yeah, but pulling in a federal judge? That's asking for trouble. Kendall's heart skipped a beat. She moved closer to the door, straining to hear. Grayson said Apex needs this done. Spencer's been a thorn in their side for too long. Still, you think the captain's going to let this slide? Doesn't matter. Grayson's got friends upstairs. He'll make it disappear. Kendall felt her blood turn to ice. Apex. She'd heard the name before. A construction company with deep pockets and a reputation for cutting corners. But what did they have to do with Malcolm Spencer? And why had she been used as a pawn in their game? That evening, Malcolm called Detective Ethan Rhodes to his home office. Ethan leaned against the desk, his expression grim as Malcolm laid out what Tony Parker had revealed. This is bigger than I thought, Ethan said, flipping through the documents. Grayson's name being tied to this? That's dangerous territory. Malcolm nodded. And if Grayson's involved, who else is? Apex's reach might extend farther than we realize. Do you think Kendall knows? Ethan asked. I doubt it. She seems more like a foot soldier following orders, Malcolm replied. But she might know enough to help us. Ethan frowned. That's risky. If she's loyal to Grayson, this could blow up in your face. I'm out of options, Malcolm said. If we don't act soon, Tony might not survive the week. Late that night, Malcolm was jolted awake by the piercing sound of his house alarm. His heart pounded as he grabbed his phone and rushed downstairs. The living room lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the cool night breeze. Malcolm hesitated, then stepped outside, his breath caught in his throat. In the middle of his yard, a small bonfire crackled, casting dancing flames against the darkness. At its center was a crude effigy, a wooden stake with a piece of cardboard attached. Scrawled across the cardboard in black paint were two words: burning justice. Malcolm's gaze shifted to the driveway where a figure in a black hoodie stood watching. The figure lingered for a moment, then turned and sprinted down the street. Hey! Malcolm shouted, running after them. The figure was fast, disappearing into the night before Malcolm could get close. He stopped at the edge of his property, his chest heaving as the implications of the message sunk in. Whoever was behind this wasn't just threatening him. They were sending a clear message. Malcolm's pursuit of justice would come at a cost. As he walked back to the house, the flames in the yard continued to burn, their light flickering against the growing darkness. The day after the fiery warning in Malcolm Spencer's yard dawned gray and overcast, as though the city itself sensed the tension brewing beneath its surface. Malcolm sat in his office, the remnants of the charred effigy still scattered across his front lawn. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flames and shadowy figures watching him from the darkness. A knock at the door startled him. His pulse quickened as he moved cautiously to answer, half expecting another veiled threat. Instead, when he opened it, Officer Laura Kendall stood on his porch, her expression a mix of hesitation and guilt. Judge Spencer, she said quietly. Malcolm didn't move, his hand gripping the edge of the door. What do you want? His voice was cold, his frustration barely contained. I need to talk to you, she said, glancing over her shoulder nervously. It's about what happened the other day. Malcolm hesitated, then stepped aside. You've got 5 minutes. Inside, Kendall stood near the edge of Malcolm's office, looking out of place against the neatly organized chaos of his desk. She glanced at the documents scattered across it, her brow furrowing. You're digging into Apex, aren't you? Malcolm crossed his arms. And why would you care? You've made it perfectly clear that you're comfortable following orders, no matter how questionable they are. Kendall flinched, but she didn't look away. You're right, she admitted, her voice low. I followed orders because I didn't think I had a choice, but I've been seeing things, hearing things, that don't add up. Malcolm didn't reply, his silence urging her to continue. Deputy Chief Grayson gave the order to pull you over, Kendall said. He told me to find a reason, any reason, to detain you. At the time, I thought it was just another routine assignment, but after hearing some of the conversations at the precinct, she trailed off, visibly struggling to find the right words. What conversations? Malcolm pressed. There's talk about Apex, she said, lowering her voice as though someone might overhear. How they're paying off people in the department, how they've got connections all the way to the mayor's office, and Grayson, he's at the center of it. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Why are you telling me this now? Kendall's gaze faltered. Because I was wrong. About you. About everything. And if what I've overheard is true, then this goes deeper than just one bad stop. I want to help, if you'll let me. An hour later, Detective Ethan Rhodes joined them in Malcolm's office. The tension between Rhodes and Kendall was palpable, but Malcolm quickly refocused the conversation on the bigger issue at hand. We have to move fast, Malcolm said, gesturing to the growing pile of evidence on his desk. Tony Parker gave me enough to start connecting the dots, but it's not enough to take to the authorities. Where is Parker now? Rhodes asked. Malcolm frowned. I don't know. I haven't been able to reach him since last night. That's not a good sign, Rhodes said grimly. He was being followed, Malcolm said, pacing the room. He knew they were watching him, but he thought he could stay ahead of them. Kendall shifted uncomfortably. If Apex knows he's been talking to you, he's probably already gone underground, or worse. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Finally, Malcolm spoke. We need more help, someone who can dig deeper into Apex's connections. I might know someone, Rhodes said. Ellis Grayson, investigative journalist, used to work for the big outlets before he went independent. He's one of the best. Grayson? Kendall asked sharply, her face paling. Yeah, Rhodes replied. Why? Kendall hesitated, then said, Ellis is Mark Grayson's brother. Malcolm's eyes widened slightly, the revelation adding a new layer of complexity to the situation. Would he even consider going against his brother? Rhodes nodded. Ellis doesn't talk much about Mark, but I know they don't see eye to eye. If anyone's willing to expose this mess, it's him. That evening, the three of them met Ellis Grayson in a dimly lit coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Ellis was tall and wiry, with sharp features and a piercing gaze that seemed to see straight through people. He listened intently as Malcolm laid out everything they knew, his expression growing darker with each detail. This isn't just about Apex, Ellis said finally, leaning back in his chair. This is about power, control. They're using Apex as a front, but the real players are the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes. Who? Malcolm asked. Ellis's lips pressed into a thin line. That's the question, isn't it? But if we follow the money, we'll find the answers. And I guarantee you won't like what we find. The next morning, Malcolm woke to another text from the unknown number. One more step, and you'll regret it. He stared at the message for a long time, the words burning into his mind. The threats were escalating, but so was his determination. By midday, Ellis had uncovered a trail of suspicious financial transactions tying Apex to several city officials. The payments were funneled through shell companies, making them difficult to trace, but not impossible. This is big, Ellis said, sliding the printed records across Malcolm's desk. If we can connect these payments to specific decisions, zoning laws, construction permits, safety violations, we'll have enough to blow this thing wide open. Do you think Mark Grayson's involved directly? Malcolm asked. Ellis's jaw tightened. If he is, I'll find out. As the day wore on, the tension among the group grew. Kendall received a call from a fellow officer warning her that people at the precinct were starting to ask questions about her loyalties. They're on to me, Kendall said, her voice tight with fear. You knew this wouldn't be easy, Malcolm said, but if you're having second thoughts— I'm not, Kendall interrupted, her voice firm. I'm in this until the end. That evening, Malcolm returned home to find his house eerily quiet. The faint smell of smoke still lingered from the previous night's fire, a reminder of the stakes they were up against. As he stepped into his office, his phone buzzed again. This time, the message was a single word: run. Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone as he stared out the window, his reflection blending with the growing darkness outside. The threats were no longer just words, they were a promise. But Malcolm wasn't running. Not now. Not ever. The late evening drizzle streaked the windows of Malcolm Spencer's office as he stared at the financial records Ellis Grayson had uncovered. A web of names, dates, and dollar amounts sprawled across his desk. Apex Industries' corruption ran deeper than even Tony Parker had hinted at. The money trail was there, subtle, fragmented, but unmistakable. Shell companies transferred funds to accounts linked to key city officials, precinct officers, and even a judge Malcolm recognized from a neighboring jurisdiction. This is damning, Malcolm muttered to himself, flipping through the pages. But it's not enough. Ellis leaned against the doorframe, his sharp eyes scanning Malcolm's expression. It'll be enough once we find the keystone, he said, stepping closer. Every conspiracy has a central figure holding the whole thing together. We just need to find them. Easier said than done, Malcolm replied, rubbing his temples. We're fighting a system designed to bury this kind of thing. Every piece of evidence we uncover feels like it comes with a bigger target on our backs. Ellis gave a wry smile. You didn't take this fight because it was easy, Judge. You took it because it's necessary. Meanwhile, in the precinct locker room, Officer Laura Kendall found herself cornered by Deputy Chief Mark Grayson. The tension between them was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Grayson's polished shoes clicked against the floor as he stepped closer, his expression a mask of forced calm. Kendall, he began, his voice low and controlled, I've been hearing things. Rumors about where your loyalties lie. Kendall didn't flinch, though her heart raced. I'm doing my job, sir. Same as always. Grayson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Your job, Officer Kendall, is to follow orders, not to ask questions, not to make waves. Kendall crossed her arms, meeting his gaze. Is that what this is about? Me following orders to pull over Judge Spencer? Because I did exactly what you asked. Grayson stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. This isn't about Spencer anymore. It's about making sure people like you remember which side they're on. I'm giving you one warning, Kendall. Stay in line, or you'll regret it. Kendall clenched her fists but said nothing as Grayson walked away, his words lingering like a dark cloud over her thoughts. The lines she thought she could toe were rapidly disappearing, leaving her with a choice she wasn't sure she was ready to make. The next day, Malcolm was driving back from a courthouse in the neighboring district. Rain slicked the roads as his car navigated the winding streets leading to his neighborhood. He replayed his conversation with Ellis in his mind, trying to piece together the scattered fragments of evidence they had collected. As he approached a curve in the road, something felt off. The brakes didn't respond as he pressed the pedal. Panic surged through him as the car sped up, skidding dangerously close to the edge of the asphalt. He yanked the wheel to avoid a tree, narrowly missing it as the car fishtailed and came to a violent stop against a guardrail. Malcolm sat in stunned silence, his hands gripping the wheel. The rain tapped against the windshield as his pulse thundered in his ears. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, the cold air biting against his skin. A closer look confirmed his worst fears. The brake lines had been cut. Ethan Rhodes arrived minutes later, his unmarked car pulling up beside Malcolm's. The detective's expression darkened as he inspected the damage. This wasn't random, Ethan said. Someone wanted you dead. Malcolm's jaw tightened. They're getting desperate. They're escalating, Ethan corrected. This isn't desperation, it's a message. And if we don't figure out who's pulling the strings, they'll try again. That evening, back at Malcolm's house, the team gathered to regroup. Kendall paced the room, clearly shaken from her earlier confrontation with Grayson. Ellis was hunched over his laptop, cross-referencing financial records with public officials' campaign donations. Malcolm stood at the window, his gaze fixed on the dark street outside. We need more, Malcolm said finally, breaking the silence. This, he gestured to the papers and files scattered across the table. It's enough to make noise, but not enough to bring them down. We need something irrefutable. We're close, Ellis said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The shell companies Apex is using to funnel bribes are tied to 2 law firms. If we can subpoena their records— We can't subpoena anything, Malcolm interrupted, not without tipping them off. Kendall stopped pacing. her expression troubled. Grayson mentioned Apex by name today, she said. He's more involved than we realized. If he's the connection between Apex and the department, maybe he's our keystone. Malcolm nodded. Then we focus on Grayson. Later that night, Malcolm sat in his empty courtroom, reviewing the files Ellis had sent earlier in the day. The stillness of the room, usually a source of solace, felt oppressive. He noticed a faint hum that hadn't been there before, a barely perceptible sound, like static. He froze, his eyes scanning the room. Something was wrong. Standing slowly, he examined the base of his desk, the corners of the walls, and the light fixtures. Then he saw it. A small, barely noticeable device tucked behind the nameplate on his bench. A recording device. Malcolm's heart sank. Someone had bugged his courtroom. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. Whoever had planted the device wasn't just watching him. They were inside his domain, violating the sanctity of his work, his mission, his identity. The weight of it all pressed down on him as he carefully removed the device, placing it in an evidence bag Ethan had left at his house. When he returned to his office, he discovered the second blow. Several of his confidential files were missing. Case notes, transcripts, evidence logs, all gone. His stomach twisted as the implications sank in. Someone wasn't just trying to threaten him. They were sabotaging him, erasing the very tools he needed to fight back. At that moment, Malcolm's phone buzzed on the desk. Another text. His hands shook as he read the message. "One more step, and you'll lose everything." He stared at the words, his mind racing. Apex's reach was broader and more insidious than he had anticipated. This wasn't just about protecting their interests, it was about ensuring absolute control. As the storm outside intensified, Malcolm felt a resolve harden within him. They had underestimated him. They thought threats and sabotage would be enough to silence him. They were wrong. The morning was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that felt like a held breath before a storm. Malcolm Spencer sat in his office, staring at the flash drive Ellis had handed him the night before. The weight of it felt heavier than its size, a tiny device carrying potentially damning evidence that could change everything. Ellis had been concise, almost too calm. "Emails," he'd said, "between Apex executives and city officials. They've been plotting this for months, Malcolm. This proves it." Now, as Malcolm plugged the flash drive into his laptop, his fingers hovered over the keyboard. He clicked on the first file, the subject line as chilling as it was direct. Judicial interference plan. The emails were worse than Malcolm had anticipated. Apex executives and their political allies spoke with chilling precision about discrediting him. Phrases like fabricated misconduct and leverage through precinct collaboration made it clear this wasn't just about removing him from the bench. It was a coordinated effort to dismantle his reputation and render him powerless. One email in particular froze Malcolm in place, from Alan Croswell to Mark Grayson. Subject, Judge Spencer. "He's a problem that needs solving immediately. Apply pressure where it hurts. If he won't back down, we make him irrelevant. And if he pushes too far, we make sure he doesn't push at all." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his pulse thundering in his ears. This was more than corruption. This was systemic rot, and he was its target. Ellis arrived mid-morning, his expression grim as Malcolm shared the emails. "This is enough to blow their operation wide open," Ellis said, but his tone carried an undertone of caution. "But if we go public too soon, they'll find a way to bury it, or worse, spin it." "We don't have time for caution," Malcolm said, pacing. "They're escalating. They sabotaged my car. They've been in my courtroom. Who knows what they'll try next?" Ellis folded his arms, considering. "Then we need to control the narrative. Let me leak some of the emails, just enough to get the public's attention. We'll build pressure before they can retaliate." "Do it," Malcolm said without hesitation. By afternoon, the fallout began. Ellis strategically leaked 2 emails, one detailing Apex's plan to bribe officials and another referencing Malcolm by name. Within hours, local news outlets picked up the story. Social media erupted with hashtags like #JusticeForSpencer and #ExposeApex. But what truly ignited the public outcry came from an unexpected source. That evening, a grainy video surfaced online. It showed Malcolm's traffic stop with Officer Kendall, recorded by a neighbor from their front porch. The footage captured the escalation, from Malcolm calmly identifying himself as a federal judge to being forced onto the pavement under Kendall's orders. The video spread like wildfire, and the public's reaction was swift and furious. Protests erupted in Malcolm's neighborhood, where residents who had once watched silently now held signs reading, "End profiling" and "Justice for Judge Spencer." From his window, Malcolm watched the crowd grow. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't his alone anymore. That night, Malcolm returned home to find a plain white envelope taped to his front door. His name was scrawled across it in bold black letters. He opened it cautiously, his stomach churning as he unfolded the note inside. "You're making this personal. She wouldn't have wanted that." His breath caught as he reread the words. She. Malcolm sank into a chair, the memory of his late wife flooding back. Celia had been his anchor, his unwavering source of strength. Her death years earlier had been devastating but natural, a car accident caused by icy roads. Or so he'd thought. Now the note felt like a blade twisting in his chest. Were they implying otherwise? Had her death been deliberate? Malcolm clenched the paper in his fist, his resolve hardening. If they thought they could use Celia to scare him into silence, they were wrong. They'd only strengthened his resolve. Across town, Laura Kendall drove through a desolate stretch of road, her eyes darting to her rearview mirror. She hadn't shaken the feeling that someone was following her since she left the precinct. The threat Grayson had leveled earlier that day replayed in her mind. Stay in line, or you'll regret it. Her grip tightened on the wheel as she turned onto a side street, hoping to throw off her pursuer. But when her headlights illuminated two black SUVs blocking the road ahead, her stomach sank. Kendall slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into reverse. She hadn't backed up more than 10 feet when another vehicle appeared behind her, boxing her in. Four masked figures emerged, moving toward her car with deliberate precision. Panic surged as Kendall reached for her sidearm, but before she could react, one of the figures shattered her window with a baton. They grabbed her arm, dragging her out of the car as she struggled and kicked. "Let go of me!" she screamed, her voice echoing in the deserted street. Before they could restrain her, the screech of tires cut through the night. Another car barreled down the road, its headlights blinding her assailants. The figures scattered as the car skidded to a stop, and Detective Ethan Rhodes stepped out, his gun drawn. "Back off!" Ethan shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who wouldn't hesitate to shoot. The masked figures hesitated, then retreated to their vehicles, disappearing into the night. Kendall collapsed against her car, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Ethan approached, his expression a mix of concern and anger. "Are you hurt?" "No," Kendall managed, her voice trembling. "But they were trying to send a message." Ethan helped her to her feet, his jaw clenched. "Whatever message they're trying to send, it's not working. Let's get out of here." As they drove back toward the city, Kendall stared out the window, her mind racing. The line between ally and enemy was growing blurrier by the day. But one thing was clear. Apex Industries wasn't just corrupt. They were ruthless. Back at Malcolm's house, the team reconvened in tense silence. Ethan recounted the ambush, his tone grim. "They're escalating. Kendall was lucky I got there in time." Ellis frowned, pacing the room. "They're feeling cornered. That means we're getting close." Malcolm placed the note referencing Celia on the table. "This just got personal. They're digging into my past, and they're willing to use my wife against me." Kendall looked up, her voice steady despite her fear. "Then we need to hit back harder." Malcolm nodded. "We're not just fighting for justice anymore. We're fighting for survival." As the storm raged outside, Malcolm knew the path ahead would only grow darker, but he also knew they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option. The day began with a quiet tension in Malcolm Spencer's home. The team, Ellis, Ethan, Kendall, and Malcolm, sat around the dining table, each focused on their role in the plan. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of what they were about to do pressing heavily on everyone's shoulders. Apex's crimes were no longer whispers in dark corners. They had the proof, and tonight, the world would hear it. Ellis tapped his laptop, bringing up drafts of the emails they would present during the live broadcast. "We've got everything we need," he said, his voice steady. "Emails, payment records, footage of the bribes. It's all here. This isn't just smoke, it's fire." "And it's about to burn a lot of powerful people," Malcolm replied. "We need to make sure they can't twist this into something it's not." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his face lined with concern. "Apex won't go down without a fight. They've already sabotaged your car, planted a bug in your courtroom, and sent thugs after Kendall. They'll try something else." "Let them try," Kendall said, her voice resolute. "We're ready for them." As the sun began to set, Malcolm and Ellis finalized the logistics for the broadcast. They had secured airtime on a major local station, thanks to Ellis's connections. The plan was simple. A live segment where Malcolm would outline Apex's corruption, followed by the release of the emails and evidence for public scrutiny. "It has to be airtight," Malcolm said, pacing the newsroom as technicians prepared the set. "No room for doubt, no room for spin." Ellis nodded. We've got this. The station's producer is on board, and the crew's been briefed. They know what's at stake. But unknown to them, Apex had already infiltrated the newsroom. Hours earlier, an Apex insider posing as a new intern had slipped into the building under the guise of assisting with setup. The mole worked quickly and discreetly, tampering with equipment and planting a program to cut the broadcast feed the moment Malcolm went live. By the time the team arrived at the station, the stage was set, not just for Malcolm's revelation, but for Apex's sabotage. As Malcolm prepared to leave for the station, a phone call from Ethan interrupted him. "We've got a problem," Ethan said. "I've been monitoring Apex chatter. They know about the broadcast." Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone. "What are they planning?" "I don't know yet," Ethan admitted. "But you should assume the worst. Be careful." "We will," Malcolm said, ending the call. He turned to Kendall, who was checking her sidearm near the front door. "We're running out of time," he said. "Let's move." The drive to the station was uneventful until they hit the final stretch. As they turned onto the main road leading to the newsroom, headlights appeared in Malcolm's rearview mirror. "That car's been following us for the last 2 blocks," Kendall said, her voice sharp. Before Malcolm could respond, the vehicle accelerated, ramming into their rear bumper. The force jolted them forward, and Malcolm fought to keep control of the wheel. "They're trying to run us off the road!" he shouted. Kendall reached for her gun. "We need to lose them!" Malcolm swerved into a side street, hoping to shake their pursuers, but another car appeared ahead, blocking their path. The first vehicle rammed them again, forcing them to stop. "Out of the car!" a masked figure shouted, stepping out of the lead vehicle. Malcolm and Kendall exchanged a glance. "We can't let them get the evidence," Malcolm said, grabbing the flash drive from the dashboard. Kendall nodded, her grip tightening on her weapon. "Follow me." They bolted from the car, sprinting into a nearby alley as their assailants gave chase. The sound of heavy boots echoed behind them, growing louder with each step. "This way," Kendall hissed, leading Malcolm through a narrow passage that opened into a crowded marketplace. The noise and chaos of the bustling area gave them cover as they weaved through the throng of people. Malcolm clutched the flash drive tightly, his heart pounding. If they lost this, everything they'd worked for would be gone. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the masked figures splitting up, searching for them in the crowd. Kendall grabbed his arm, pulling him toward a service entrance at the back of a building. "In here!" They slipped inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The room was dark and smelled of cleaning chemicals. Kendall barricaded the door with a nearby chair, then turned to Malcolm. "We need to call Ethan." Malcolm nodded, pulling out his phone. His hands were trembling, but his voice was steady. "Ethan, we've been ambushed. We're in a storage room behind the marketplace on 5th. Can you get to us?" "I'm on my way," Ethan replied. "Stay put." At the station, Ellis was growing increasingly nervous. Malcolm and Kendall were late, and the broadcast was set to go live in less than 30 minutes. The mole, sensing an opportunity, approached the producer. "I think we're having technical issues with the feed," they said. "I'll take a look." The producer nodded, distracted by the flurry of activity in the control room. The mole slipped away, heading toward the server room to finalize the sabotage. Back in the storage room, Malcolm and Kendall heard footsteps approaching. Kendall raised her weapon, motioning for Malcolm to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and then there was a loud banging. "Kendall!" Ethan's voice called out. "It's me!" Kendall quickly unblocked the door, letting Ethan in. He was out of breath but unharmed. "We need to move. I parked a few blocks away to avoid being spotted." "What about them?" Malcolm asked, gesturing to the marketplace where their pursuers were still searching. "They won't find us if we move fast," Ethan said. "Let's go." The trio made their way to Ethan's car, staying in the shadows to avoid detection. By the time they arrived at the station, the broadcast was minutes away from starting. Inside, Ellis greeted them with a mix of relief and urgency. "You're cutting it close," he said. "Everything ready?" Malcolm handed him the flash drive. "It's all here. Let's do this." As they moved toward the set, Ellis noticed something unusual on his monitor. A sudden spike in network activity. His eyes narrowed. "Wait, something's not right." "What is it?" Malcolm asked. Ellis's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Someone's trying to cut the feed." Kendall stepped forward. "Can you stop them?" "I can try," Ellis said. "But if they've planted someone inside, we need to find them before they can do any more damage." As the clock ticked down, Malcolm took his seat under the bright studio lights, preparing for the most important speech of his life. Outside, Kendall and Ethan searched the station for the mole, while Ellis worked frantically to secure the broadcast. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The camera's red light blinked on, and Malcolm began to speak, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "This is a message for the people of this city," he began. "For too long, corruption has ruled unchecked. Tonight, that changes." As he spoke, Apex's influence loomed closer, its shadow threatening to consume everything they had worked for. The air inside the newsroom was electric with tension. Malcolm Spencer sat under the bright glare of studio lights, his heart pounding in time with the countdown ticking down in his earpiece. Around him, the production team moved like clockwork, their faces a mix of focus and apprehension. Behind the glass of the control room, Ellis Grayson stood hunched over a console, monitoring every detail of the broadcast setup. Malcolm took a steadying breath as the floor manager signaled 3 minutes to go. He tightened his grip on the flash drive in his hand, the small device now a symbol of everything they had sacrificed for this moment. Across the city, chaos was unfolding. Apex executives had already caught wind of the upcoming broadcast, their panic spilling into heated conference calls and hastily issued orders. In the mayor's office, city officials scrambled to spin the narrative, while in the precinct, Deputy Chief Mark Grayson barked orders into his phone. "I don't care what it takes," Grayson growled. "Get down to that station and shut it down. Arrest Spencer if you have to." As the final countdown ticked away, Malcolm's voice came through the speakers in every home tuned to the live broadcast. "Good evening," he began, his tone calm but commanding. "My name is Judge Malcolm Spencer. Tonight I come to you with a message that cannot wait, a message about corruption, power, and the truth that has been hidden for far too long." The camera cut to a graphic showing documents and emails from Apex Industries, each one labeled with damning headlines: bribes to city officials, zoning law manipulation, courtroom interference. Malcolm continued, laying out the evidence with a precision honed by years on the bench. "What you see here are not accusations. They are facts, backed by records that expose a system designed to serve greed at the expense of justice." In the control room, Ellis scanned the monitors, his fingers flying over the keyboard. He noticed a spike in the station's security system and frowned. Someone was trying to breach their servers. "We've got company," Ellis muttered into his headset. "Stay sharp." As Malcolm's broadcast reached its midpoint, the newsroom doors burst open. Deputy Chief Grayson stormed in, flanked by 6 officers, their boots echoing loudly on the tile floor. The room froze, all eyes on the intruders. Grayson pointed directly at Malcolm. "This broadcast is over! Malcolm Spencer, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy." Gasps rippled through the production team, but Malcolm didn't flinch. He met Grayson's gaze and turned back to the camera. "What you're witnessing now," he said, his voice steady, "is the very corruption I've been speaking about. These officers are here to silence the truth." Grayson's face darkened as he advanced toward Malcolm, but before he could reach him, Laura Kendall stepped forward. "Wait!" Kendall's voice rang out, clear and resolute. She placed herself between Grayson and Malcolm, her hand raised to halt her fellow officers. "Before you take another step, there's something the world needs to know." Grayson stopped, his expression a mix of fury and unease. "Kendall, what are you doing?" "I'm doing what I should have done from the start," Kendall said, her voice firm. She turned toward the camera, her face a mask of determination. "My name is Officer Laura Kendall, and I was part of the conspiracy against Judge Spencer. I was ordered to detain him under false pretenses, and I followed those orders without question. But I've since learned the full extent of what's been happening." The room was silent, save for the hum of the broadcast equipment. "I want to apologize," Kendall continued, her voice breaking slightly, "to Judge Spencer, to my community, and to everyone watching. What we're dealing with isn't just about Apex Industries. It's about a culture of corruption that has infected our city, and at the heart of it is Deputy Chief Mark Grayson." Grayson's face twisted in rage. "Enough of this nonsense. Officers, take her into custody." But the officers hesitated, their expressions conflicted. Kendall's confession had shaken them, planting seeds of doubt. Kendall didn't back down. "You want to arrest me? Fine. But you won't stop this broadcast, and you won't stop the truth from coming out." In the control room, Ellis's monitor flashed red. The mole Apex had planted in the newsroom had activated the program to cut the feed. Ellis sprang into action, his fingers moving with practiced precision to override the sabotage. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the program fought back, but he managed to reroute the signal to an external backup. The broadcast continued uninterrupted. As the standoff in the studio intensified, Malcolm rose from his seat, holding the flash drive aloft. "The people of this city deserve better than this," he said, his voice rising. "They deserve leaders who are accountable, officers who protect and serve, and a justice system that upholds the truth." Grayson's composure snapped. He lunged toward Malcolm, barking, "Take him down!" The officers behind him moved forward, but Ellis's voice crackled through the newsroom speakers. "The whole city is watching, Grayson. Every second of this is live. Do you really want to make your move now?" Grayson froze, realizing the precariousness of his position. But instead of backing down, he snarled, "Take him!" The officers advanced, and Malcolm didn't resist as they cuffed his hands behind his back. He kept his gaze fixed on the camera. "Let this moment be a reminder," he said, his voice unwavering. "No matter how powerful they seem, the truth will always prevail." As the officers escorted Malcolm out of the studio, Kendall turned to Ellis. "Do you have the drive?" Ellis nodded, slipping it into his jacket. "I'll get it out. No matter what happens here, the truth is safe." Kendall gave him a grim smile. "Good. Now go." Ellis slipped out the back entrance of the station, the flash drive secured in his pocket. He moved quickly, blending into the shadows as he made his way toward a safe house they had prepared earlier. Every step felt like a victory, but he knew the battle was far from over. Meanwhile, Malcolm was loaded into the back of a squad car, his expression calm despite the chaos around him. Protesters had gathered outside the station, their chants echoing in the night. "Justice for Spencer! Down with Apex!" Kendall stood at the studio entrance, watching the scene unfold. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. The fight for the city's soul was just beginning, and she intended to see it through to the end. As the squad car pulled away, Malcolm glanced at the skyline illuminated by streetlights and the glow of the protests. Despite his arrest, he felt a spark of hope. The truth was out there now, beyond Apex's reach, and it was only a matter of time before the whole system came crashing down. The morning after the broadcast, the city was in an uproar. Social media platforms were flooded with clips of Malcolm Spencer's live expose, Kendall's confession, and the chaotic scenes of Deputy Chief Grayson's attempted shutdown. The hashtag #JusticeForSpencer trended nationwide, sparking discussions about corruption, accountability, and systemic reform. For Malcolm, the day began in a stark holding cell at the precinct. The cold steel bench beneath him and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead were a sharp contrast to the warmth of the community he had seen rallying outside. He sat upright, his gaze steady despite the uncertainty of his situation. The sound of keys jangling broke the silence. The cell door opened and Ethan Rhodes stepped in, his expression triumphant. "You're free to go," Ethan said. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" "A lot," Ethan replied. "Let's just say your broadcast shook the tree hard enough for the feds to start picking fruit. They've launched a full-scale investigation into Apex, and Grayson's officially been placed on administrative leave. For now." Malcolm stood, smoothing his rumpled suit. "And the charges against me?" "Dropped," Ethan said. "The evidence Ellis smuggled out cleared your name and put Apex executives in the spotlight. You've become untouchable, at least for the moment." Across town, Laura Kendall sat in a dimly lit interrogation room, her hands clasped tightly on the table. Two federal agents faced her, their expressions neutral but probing. "You understand the gravity of what you've admitted to, Officer Kendall?" one of them asked. "I do," Kendall replied. "But I also know what I've done to try and make it right. I'm here to tell the truth about Grayson, Apex, and everything I've seen." Her voice didn't waver as she recounted the orders she had followed, the corruption she had witnessed, and the risks she had taken to expose it. By the end of her testimony, the agents exchanged a glance, nodding slightly. "Your cooperation is noted," one of them said, "and it will weigh heavily in any decision about charges. But for now, your testimony is pivotal." By midday, news of the federal investigation dominated the airwaves. Images of Apex executives being led away in handcuffs played on every screen. Among them was Alan Croswell, the CEO whose emails had outlined the conspiracy with chilling clarity. Deputy Chief Grayson's turn came shortly after. Cameras captured his face, a mix of defiance and fear, as he was escorted from the precinct. Protesters outside jeered and chanted, holding signs demanding accountability. In the evening, Malcolm stood at the front of a packed community center. The town hall meeting had been his idea, a way to channel the public's energy into something constructive. He looked out at the crowd, neighbors, activists, students, and even some local officials. They had all come to hear him speak, to find a way forward together. Malcolm took a deep breath, his voice steady as he began. "What we witnessed this week was a reckoning," he said. "A reckoning for those who believed they could exploit our city for personal gain. But this isn't just about Apex or Grayson. This is about a system that allowed their corruption to thrive. He paused, letting his words sink in. The fight for justice doesn't end with arrests. It doesn't end with headlines. Real change requires all of us, every single one of us, to demand accountability and to build systems that are fair, transparent, and just. The room was silent, hanging on his every word. Malcolm's gaze swept over the crowd, landing on familiar faces. Mrs. Turner, who had recorded the traffic stop, young activists holding signs calling for reform, and even Laura Kendall, sitting in the back, her expression a mix of guilt and determination. "We've proven that one voice can make a difference," Malcolm continued. "Now imagine what we can do when we raise our voices together." The room erupted in applause, a sound that filled Malcolm with hope. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs. As the meeting ended, Kendall approached Malcolm, her steps tentative but purposeful. "Judge Spencer," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Laura," Malcolm replied, offering a small smile. "Or should I say Officer Kendall?" "Not for much longer," she said. "I've been placed on leave while the investigation unfolds, and honestly, I think it's the right call." Malcolm nodded. "You've done a lot to make things right. That matters more than you know." Kendall hesitated, then said, "I want to thank you for giving me the chance to do the right thing, and if there's anything I can do to help with what's next, just say the word." "There will be plenty to do," Malcolm said. "Rebuilding trust in this community won't happen overnight, but with people like you, it's possible." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Federal investigators uncovered layers of corruption that extended beyond Apex and the precinct, implicating several city officials and even a state senator. Malcolm, now an unofficial advisor to the investigation, worked tirelessly to ensure the momentum for reform didn't falter. Ellis Grayson's articles on the case went viral, cementing his reputation as one of the most fearless investigative journalists in the state. Ethan Rhodes, meanwhile, spearheaded efforts within the police department to rebuild integrity and restore public trust. 1 month later, Malcolm stood outside the courthouse, watching as Laura Kendall took the stand in a high-profile trial against Apex executives and Mark Grayson. Her testimony was detailed and unflinching, providing the jury with a first-hand account of the conspiracy. Her words were pivotal, helping to secure convictions against those who had once wielded power with impunity. That evening, Malcolm returned to his neighborhood, where a smaller, quieter gathering awaited him. Residents had organized a candlelight vigil to honor the progress they had made and to remember the struggles that had brought them there. As Malcolm lit his candle, a young boy approached him. Tommy, the neighbor who had once warned him about Apex's threats. "Judge Spencer," Tommy said, his voice shy but eager. "Is it over now?" Malcolm crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze. "Not yet, Tommy, but we've made a big step forward." Tommy nodded, his expression serious. "Good, because my dad says we need more people like you." Malcolm smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and resolve. "We need more people like you too, Tommy. Never stop speaking up for what's right." As the vigil continued, Malcolm looked around at the faces illuminated by candlelight. There was still so much work to be done. Policies to reform, systems to rebuild, and hearts to heal. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. This wasn't just the end of one battle. It was the beginning of something greater. A community united in its pursuit of justice, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. And Malcolm Spencer would be there, every step of the way. The courtroom, where Malcolm Spencer had spent the better part of his career, was now silent. Rows of polished benches gleamed under the soft glow of overhead lights. For years, this room had been his sanctuary, a place where truth and justice were meant to prevail. But now, as he stood before a gathering of colleagues, friends, and members of the press, Malcolm knew it was time to take a different path. He adjusted the microphone, scanning the sea of faces before him. "For many years, I've had the honor of serving as a judge in this courthouse. It's a role I've cherished, a responsibility I've carried with pride. But recent events have shown me that the fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It begins long before a case is ever heard." He paused, letting his words settle in the stillness of the room. "Today I'm resigning from the bench. I do so not because I'm giving up the fight, but because I'm shifting my focus. The work we've started, exposing corruption, rebuilding trust, and holding those in power accountable, must continue. And I believe I can do more to advance that work from outside these walls." The room erupted into applause, a mixture of support and sorrow for the end of an era. Malcolm stepped back, catching sight of familiar faces in the crowd, Ethan Rhodes nodded with quiet pride, while Ellis Grayson gave him a thumbs up. Laura Kendall stood near the back, her posture straight and her expression resolute. The next chapter of Malcolm's life began in an unassuming office building. With the funds raised from community donations and partnerships with reform-minded organizations, Malcolm founded the Justice Alliance Initiative, JAI, a nonprofit dedicated to exposing corruption, advocating for systemic reform, and educating communities on their legal rights. The office buzzed with activity. Volunteers and staff members worked at desks piled with case files, laptops, and stacks of reports. On the wall, a large map of the city was pinned with red flags, each one representing a community in need of JAI's support. Laura Kendall, now a full-time investigator for JAI, entered Malcolm's office holding a folder. "We've got another tip," she said, dropping the folder onto his desk. "This one's about a housing developer skirting zoning laws with the help of some city council members." Malcolm glanced at the folder, nodding. "Let's prioritize it. Housing violations often hit the most vulnerable the hardest." Kendall hesitated before speaking. "You've built something incredible here, Malcolm. It's only been a few months, but the impact is already being felt." Malcolm smiled. "We've only just begun. There's still so much to do." One sunny afternoon, Malcolm returned to his old neighborhood. Children played in the yards, and the hum of conversation floated through the air. The community had changed since the events that had shaken it months ago. People were more engaged, more united. The divisions once sown by fear and prejudice were slowly healing. As Malcolm approached his front steps, he spotted young Tommy sitting on the porch, a notebook balanced on his knees. The boy looked up, his face lighting up with excitement. "Judge Spencer!" Malcolm chuckled. "Just Malcolm now, Tommy." The boy grinned, shifting to make room. "You'll always be a judge to me. You're the one who stood up when no one else would." Malcolm sat beside him. "What are you working on there?" Tommy held up the notebook, revealing neatly written pages. "It's for school. We're supposed to write about someone who inspires us, and I picked you." Malcolm's chest tightened with emotion. "That's an honor, Tommy." "What are you writing about?" Tommy's expression grew serious. "About how you fought for what's right, even when it was hard, and how you showed people like me that we can make a difference too." Malcolm placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You can make a difference, Tommy. You already have." The boy hesitated before speaking again. I think I want to be a lawyer one day. Like you, but not just in a courtroom. I want to help people who don't have anyone else to fight for them." Malcolm felt a swell of pride. "You'll make a great lawyer, Tommy. And when the time comes, if you ever need advice or guidance, my door will always be open." Tommy nodded, his determination shining in his young eyes. That evening, as Malcolm prepared to close his office for the night, a courier arrived. The man handed him a plain envelope with no return address. Malcolm opened it carefully, his instincts on high alert. Inside was a single piece of paper, bearing only a brief typed message. "Apex was just the beginning. Dig deeper, and you'll find them. A friend." Malcolm's heart raced as he reread the note. Attached to it was a small USB drive. He inserted it into his laptop, revealing a series of encrypted files. His mind buzzed with questions. Who had sent this? And what was the beginning referring to? He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the new challenge pressing on him. The corruption they had uncovered with Apex had been extensive, but this hinted at something even larger. Something that went beyond city politics and local corporations. Malcolm's phone buzzed, and he saw a text from Ellis. "Late night coffee? Got some ideas for the next article." Malcolm replied, "Give me 30 minutes. We've got a lot to discuss." As he locked the office and stepped out into the cool night air, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but he wasn't alone anymore. With allies like Ellis, Ethan, and Laura by his side, and young voices like Tommy's emerging from the next generation, he knew they were building something that would endure. The city skyline glimmered in the distance, each light representing a life touched by their efforts. Malcolm took a deep breath, his resolve solidifying. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it head on. For justice, for truth, for the future. As we close this chapter of Judge Malcolm Spencer's journey, I want to leave you with a few questions to ponder. What would you have done in Malcolm's position? Could you have shown the same courage to fight for justice, even when the odds were stacked against you? Do you think true systemic change is possible, or will corruption always find a way to survive? If you were in Tommy's shoes, inspired by someone like Malcolm, how would you choose to make a difference in your community? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about this powerful story.